At 3 a.m., the skies over New Guinea were torn apart by the roar of engines. A P-38 swooped down like lightning. In the cockpit, a 22-year-old man gripped the controls tightly. Just minutes later, 4 Japanese planes burst into flames, and history began to take a different course. July 26, 1943. Over the steaming jungles of New Guinea's Markham Valley, the sky begins to shake. Twin-engine fighters from the U.S. Army Air Forces charge forward their propellers, howling as they enter hostile airspace. Waiting for them are Japan's best Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys, fast, agile, and flown by experienced pilots who have already tasted victory. Inside the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, a 22-year-old American grips the controls. His name is Richard Bong. Sweat runs down his back, but his focus never wavers. When the first burst of fire erupts from the Lightning's nose, the fight is decided in seconds. One enemy falls, then another. By the end of the mission, 4 Japanese aircraft burn toward the jungle below. It is the greatest day of Bong's career. But it is also the moment that raises a dangerous question: was this aircraft always destined for greatness, or is this victory hiding a far more complicated truth? 2. That question pulls us backward 5 years before Bong's guns ever fired into a world far removed from burning jungles and twisting dogfights. In 1938, the U.S. Army Air Corps was quietly worried. Enemy bombers were getting faster, flying higher, and America had no fighter that could reliably reach them. What the Air Corps needed was radical. And radical ideas rarely survive military paperwork. Enter 2 young officers, Benjamin S. Kelsey and Gordon P. Saville. They weren't generals. They didn't have influence, but they had vision. Together, they drafted an extraordinary request, Circular Proposal X-608. It called for a fighter that could climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, exceed 360 miles per hour, and carry a brutal concentration of firepower. There was just one problem. Army regulations capped fighter armament at 500 pounds, far too little for what Kelsey imagined. So he bent the rules. He didn't call it a fighter. He called it an interceptor. One word changed everything. The proposal demanded twin engines, liquid cooling, turbo superchargers, even tricycle landing gear ideas that sounded reckless in 1938. Most companies walked away. One did not. At Lockheed, engineers leaned into the madness. What emerged on their drafting tables didn't look like anything in the sky. 2 long booms, a central cockpit, all the guns packed into the nose. It was strange. It was risky. And on paper, it promised to be the fastest, most heavily armed fighter America had ever imagined. But no one yet knew the price this design would demand, or how unforgiving the air would be when theory met combat. 3. If the idea behind the Lightning was radical, its shape was downright shocking. When engineers at Lockheed began translating Circular Proposal X-608 into metal, they quickly realized that a conventional fighter simply wouldn't work. Too much power, too much weight, too much ambition. Something had to give, and instead, everything changed. What emerged was unlike any American fighter before it. 2 long engine booms stretched backward like claws. Between them sat a narrow central nacelle holding the cockpit and something far more dangerous. All of the P-38's guns were packed tightly into the nose. No wing-mounted weapons, no convergence problems. Wherever the pilot aimed, every round struck as one. Early prototypes experimented with heavy cannons, but the final formula was brutal and precise, 120 millimeter. Hispano cannon backed by 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns. In 1939, this was overwhelming firepower. A single burst could rip an enemy aircraft apart. For the pilot, it meant confidence. For the target, there was no warning, only destruction. But firepower was only half the equation. The Lightning's twin Allison 1710 engines fed by turbo superchargers gave it performance at altitude no other American fighter could touch. Even the landing gear broke tradition, tricycle-style forward-thinking, built for speed and stability. On paper, the aircraft was a marvel. In reality, it was a gamble stacked on top of another gamble. Every innovation solved one problem and created two more. The P-38 was powerful, fast, and deadly, but also complex, unforgiving, and utterly dependent on its pilot's skill. This was not a fighter for the average man. It was a machine that demanded respect. And soon it would demand proof at speeds no American pilot had ever faced before. 4. By early 1939, the gamble was ready to leave the drawing board. Lockheed's strange new interceptor, now known as the XP-38, rolled onto the runway for its first true test. And at the controls was the man who had started it all, Benjamin S. Kelsey himself. The moment the throttles went forward, the aircraft revealed its true nature. The twin Allison engines roared, and the XP-38 surged ahead with a confidence no American fighter had ever shown. In the air, it was stunning. Faster than anything the Army Air Corps possessed. Sleeker, deadlier. During testing, the aircraft shattered expectations, reaching speeds over 420 miles per hour, numbers that seemed almost impossible in 1939. To prove it, Kelsey pushed further. He flew the XP-38 across the entire United States coast to coast in just over 7 hours, a transcontinental speed record that stunned the aviation world. The message was clear: this aircraft was not the future. It was already there. Then, in a cruel twist, everything went wrong. Approaching the final airfield, flying slowly in a landing pattern, ice formed in the carburetors. The engines began to fail. The XP-38 fell short of the runway and slammed into a shallow creek, tearing itself apart in a violent belly landing. The prototype was destroyed. The pilot survived. And for a brief moment, it looked like the Lightning story might end right there, written off as too fast, too complex, too dangerous. But the damage had already been done, not to the airplane, but to the imagination of the Army Air Corps. They had seen what it could do. Speed like that couldn't be ignored. Within weeks, orders followed. The XP-38 was dead, but the P-38 Lightning was officially alive and racing toward a war it was never truly designed to fight the easy way. 5. With orders secured and war looming on the horizon, the Lightning stepped out of the shadows. By the summer and fall of 1941, the first production P-38s were rolling off Lockheed's assembly lines, their twin booms and central cockpit unlike anything the American public had ever seen. And then, just weeks before everything changed, the aircraft made its quiet debut. In November 1941, the New York Times published a photograph from a public aircraft display. Fighters from Allied nations sat lined up for civilians to admire, but one aircraft drew all the attention: a twin-engine interceptor with two fuselages. No visible gun ports, no explanations. The caption made it clear its armament remained a secret. That mystery only fueled speculation. Twin-engine fighters already had a reputation, and not a good one. Across the Atlantic, Germany's Messerschmitt Bf 110 had promised dominance but delivered disappointment. It was fast, yes, but too big, too sluggish, and easy prey for single-engine fighters. Many believed the Lightning would suffer the same fate. But the P-38 wasn't trying to be a Bf 110. It was built for altitude speed and firepower, an interceptor meant to smash enemies before they could strike. To some, it looked like the future of air combat. To others, it looked like a beautiful mistake waiting to happen. Then on December 7, 1941, the question of whether the Lightning belonged in war vanished overnight. After attack on Pearl Harbor, secrecy gave way to urgency. Every available aircraft was needed. Every gamble would be tested. The P-38 Lightning was no longer an experiment. It was about to prove under fire whether its radical design was genius or hubris. 6. If the Lightning was going to earn its place in the war, there was no harsher courtroom than Britain. In 1941, with Europe already burning, the Royal Air Force took a hard look at America's radical new interceptor. On paper, it seemed perfect. The same Allison engines as the P-40. Exceptional high-altitude speed, long range. The RAF placed large orders and gave the aircraft a name that crackled with promised lightning. But reality arrived the moment the wheels touched British soil. Almost immediately, problems surfaced. To simplify logistics, the RAF demanded a version with engines rotating in the same direction, abandoning the counter-rotating propellers Lockheed had carefully designed. The result was brutal. Ground handling became treacherous. Takeoffs turned into white-knuckle events. Then came the killer. During high-speed dives, pilots began reporting something terrifying. The controls would lock solid. The aircraft pitched down harder, faster, dragging itself deeper into the dive. The tail shook violently. Airspeed climbed toward the unknown. Some pilots never recovered. They had only seconds to choose fight the airplane or bail out. This phenomenon, later known as compressibility, was poorly understood at the time. Test pilots on both sides of the Atlantic were discovering the edge of physics at the same moment, and the Lightning was finding it the hard way. Accidents mounted. Confidence collapsed. The RAF had seen enough. Orders were canceled. The verdict was devastating. The Lightning, once full of promise, was quietly labeled dangerous, unstable, and unfit for combat in Europe. For Lockheed, it was a disaster. For the P-38, it was a near-death sentence. Yet behind closed doors, engineers refused to accept that this was the end. The problem wasn't speed, it wasn't firepower, it was control. And if they could solve that, Lightning might still strike back. 7. The Lightning was wounded, but it wasn't dead. As British orders collapsed, engineers at Lockheed went back to work with urgency bordering on desperation. The enemy was no longer pilot skill or tactics. It was physics itself. Compressibility, the invisible wall waiting in high-speed dives, had to be beaten, or the P-38 would never survive combat. The fixes didn't come easily. Several ideas failed. One test pilot was killed pushing the aircraft too far. But slowly, painfully, progress was made. Engineers added quick-acting dive recovery flaps beneath the wings, giving pilots back a measure of control when the aircraft tried to bury its own nose into the earth. The problem wasn't erased, but it was tamed. For the first time, pilots had a fighting chance to pull out of a deadly dive. Still, the damage to the Lightning's reputation lingered. And then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, hesitation vanished overnight. The United States didn't have the luxury of perfect aircraft anymore. It needed fighters now. Every P-38 originally built for Britain was immediately taken over by the U.S. Army Air Forces. Not only that, new orders followed fast. The same airplane that Europe had rejected was suddenly back in demand. The Lightning had been given a second life not because it was flawless, but because it was fast, heavily armed, and already real. As America rushed toward war on two oceans, the P-38 Lightning was no longer an experiment or a disappointment. It was an unproven weapon about to be tested, where failure would mean death and success would mean survival. 8. The Lightning's second chance didn't begin in Europe or the tropics. It began in the cold, empty skies of the far north. In the summer of 1942, far from headlines and glory, P-38 Lightning units were sent to one of the most unforgiving theaters of the war, Alaska. Here, over endless ocean and jagged islands, mistakes were fatal, and rescue was never guaranteed. Operating from remote bases in the Aleutian Islands, pilots of the 343rd Fighter Group flew long patrols through freezing cloud layers and violent winds. There were no cheering crowds, only ice isolation and the constant threat of mechanical failure. But on August 9, 1942, the Lightning finally spoke with guns. Two large Japanese flying boats, H-6K, Mavis patrol bombers appeared on the horizon. Big, slow, vulnerable, the P-38s attacked without hesitation. Concentrated fire tore through the enemy aircraft, sending both down in flames. They were the Lightning's first confirmed kills. Not dramatic dogfights, not aces, but proof. Proof that the aircraft could fight and win. Almost simultaneously, halfway around the world, P-38s arrived in Britain once again, this time wearing American markings. Just 5 days after the Alaska victory, another Lightning claimed its first European success, shooting down a German FW-200 Condor over the Atlantic. It was the first Luftwaffe aircraft ever destroyed by a U.S. Army fighter. 2 oceans, 2 victories. The Lightning had finally drawn blood, but these early successes were only a warning shot. Ahead lay the true test against experienced German pilots in crowded skies, where reputation mattered as much as performance. And that was where the Lightning's fight for survival would become brutal. 9. If Alaska had been a quiet proving ground, North Africa was a brutal wake-up call. By late 1942, P-38 Lightning squadrons were rushed into the Mediterranean to join the fight under the U.S. 12th Air Force. Here, there were no slow patrol bombers, only the hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe men who had survived years of combat over Europe. The first encounters were unforgiving. American pilots were brave, but doctrine lagged behind reality. Tactics were rigid. Experience was thin. And the Germans quickly learned the Lightning's weaknesses. In dogfights, Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190 pilots discovered a simple escape dive. When they did, many P-38 pilots refused to follow, knowing that compressibility could lock their controls and kill them faster than enemy guns. Losses mounted. Victories came, but not enough. Squadrons were drained so badly that replacement aircraft had to be ferried in from England just to keep units operational. The Lightning, once hailed as revolutionary, was now whispered about with doubt. Some pilots trusted it. Others feared it. Reputation began to turn poisonous. As the campaign pushed toward Italy in 1943, the situation worsened. American bombers needed escort, but fighters were ordered to stay glued to them, easy targets for German interceptors that could choose when and how to attack. The Lightning was fighting not just the enemy, but flawed tactics and its own growing stigma. By now, one thing was clear. The P-38 was no longer fighting for victory alone. It was fighting for its name against the most experienced fighter pilots in the world in skies where mercy did not exist. 10. By early 1943, the damage was done. In the Mediterranean skies, the P-38 Lightning had become a paradox, capable of moments of brilliance, yet burdened by heavy losses and growing distrust. Pilots whispered that it was cursed. Commanders quietly questioned whether it belonged on the front lines at all. The Lightning wasn't just losing aircraft, it was losing faith. And so the U.S. Army Air Forces went looking for something it desperately needed: good news. In the spring of 1943, they found it, or at least they tried to. During a large fighter sweep, P-38 units claimed dozens of German aircraft destroyed in a single day. The numbers were impressive. The timing was perfect. Soon after, Life magazine ran a dramatic story declaring that the Lightning had finally broken its hoodoo, its bad luck. The article told a chilling tale. A captured German pilot, shaken and hysterical, allegedly babbled about a terrifying enemy he called the fork-tailed devil. The implication was clear. The Luftwaffe feared the P-38. The curse was over. The Lightning had arrived. But beneath the headlines, cracks showed. Historians would later find no earlier German records using the term. No names, no unit, no confirmation. To many, it looked less like enemy testimony and more like a carefully crafted rescue mission for a struggling aircraft's image. That didn't mean the Lightning was useless. Far from it. But perception now mattered as much as performance. The P-38 stood at a crossroads, celebrated in magazines, questioned in combat reports, praised by some pilots, dismissed by others. The truth was uncomfortable. The Lightning was neither miracle nor failure. It was a powerful machine trapped in the wrong war at the wrong time, fighting enemies who knew exactly how to exploit its flaws. And the verdict on whether it was truly feared or merely misunderstood was still far from settled. 11. If the headlines couldn't decide the Lightning's fate, perhaps the enemy could. As 1943 dragged on, the most telling opinions didn't come from American press offices, but from the men flying against it. And among them were some of the most dangerous fighter pilots alive. To Adolf Galland, the verdict was blunt. He later compared the Lightning to Germany's own troubled twin-engine fighters, fast, impressive on paper, but burdened by limitations in real combat. Against single-engine opponents, he believed the odds favored the Luftwaffe. Another high-scoring ace, Hans Joachim Marcel, was even more dismissive, claiming the P-38 was easy to outmaneuver and rarely survived a properly executed fight. But not all German pilots agreed. One voice stood apart. Franz Stigler remembered the Lightning very differently. He warned young pilots never to attack it head-on. Its nose-mounted guns turned frontal passes into instant death. Worse still, he recalled how the P-38 could climb with shocking speed, snapping upward from level flight and catching attackers off guard. More than a few Luftwaffe pilots paid for that mistake with their lives. So which version was true? Was the Lightning an overhyped failure or a misunderstood killer? The answer was uncomfortable. Both sides were right. In the hands of an average pilot, the P-38 could be unforgiving, even lethal to its own. In the hands of a skilled one, it became a predator with reach firepower and brutal precision. By now, one truth was undeniable. The Lightning didn't reward mistakes. It punished them. And that made it one of the most polarizing fighters in the sky, respected by some, underestimated by others, and still fighting to define what it truly was. 12. By late 1943, the Lightning's future hung by a thread. Critics were loud, losses were real, and yet behind the scenes, one quiet decision made years earlier was about to give the P-38 a final chance to matter. When Benjamin S. Kelsey had helped shape the Lightning back in 1941, he had done something dangerous. Against official doctrine and without putting it in writing, he urged Lockheed to design the P-38 so it could carry external drop tanks. At the time, fighter escorts were considered unnecessary. Bombers, it was believed, would always fight their way through alone. Any aircraft designed with long-range escort in mind risked being ignored or worse, canceled. Kelsey gambled anyway. Now that gamble paid off. As the U.S. Army Air Forces prepared to take the air war directly over Germany, with the newly formed 8th Air Force Range became everything. Fighters had to fly farther than ever before, deep into enemy territory and back. Most couldn't. The P-38 could. With drop tanks fitted, the Lightning suddenly possessed something no other American fighter in Europe truly had: endurance at altitude. It could stay with the bombers longer. It could fight on the way in and sometimes on the way out. For the first time, the P-38 wasn't just surviving the war. It had a role only it could fill. Training improved. Tactics evolved. Pilots learned how to exploit the Lightning's strengths, its climb, its firepower, its stability as a gun platform. From England, P-38s began flying some of the earliest long-range escort missions into the Reich. This was the moment the Lightning had been waiting for. Not redemption yet, but relevance. And in the skies, over occupied Europe, relevance meant everything. 13. Relevance, however, didn't mean comfort or confidence. As P-38 settled into English airfields, a new enemy emerged. One no gun could stop the cold. The Lightning's radical design placed its cockpit far forward, isolated from the warmth of its twin engines. At high altitude over Europe, temperatures plunged. Pilots returned from missions with numb fingers, stiff legs, and faces burned raw by freezing air. Some wondered if the airplane was fighting them as much as the enemy. Then the rumors began. In mess halls and hangars, whispers spread that the P-38 Lightning was a death trap if you had to bail out. The fear was simple and terrifying: jump, and you'd slam straight into the horizontal tail between the twin booms. Once the idea took hold, it grew teeth. Young pilots climbed into their cockpits already imagining the worst. Lockheed knew perception could kill as surely as flak. So they fought back, not with press releases, but with training. Instructional films were produced blunt and technical, explaining exactly how to escape a damaged Lightning. Roll inverted and drop cleanly, or exit through the left window and slide down the wing. At speed, airflow would carry a pilot safely clear. The twin booms instructors insisted were no more dangerous than a single tail. The truth was less dramatic than the rumors, but fear rarely listens to truth. Add in Germany's best pilots now being concentrated on the Western Front, and the pressure mounted. FW-19 OHOs and BF-109s were everywhere, flown by men who knew how to exploit hesitation. The Lightning could still fight. It could still kill. But confidence was fragile, and in air combat, doubt was deadly. The P-38 had finally found its mission in Europe, but now it faced a quieter battle inside the cockpit and inside the minds of the men who flew it. 14. By early 1944, doubt was no longer a rumor, it was measurable. Mission reports told a brutal story. Over Germany, the P-38 Lightning was reaching a hard invisible limit. German fighters weren't just outmaneuvering it, they were outrunning physics the Lightning couldn't follow. RAF test pilots now flying captured Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 delivered the verdict American commanders didn't want to hear. In combat dives, those aircraft could safely push to nearly Mach 0.75. The P-38 could not. At around Mach 0.68 compressibility returned. Controls stiffened, authority vanished, and survival became a gamble. German pilots learned quickly. If a fight turned against them, they simply dove. Lightning pilots knew better than to follow. The result was deadly asymmetry. The enemy chose when to fight and when to escape. Escorts peeled away. Bombers were left exposed. Losses climbed. For commanders planning the air war over Europe, this was unacceptable. Escort fighters had to dominate the vertical fight down as well as up. The Lightning, despite its range and firepower, couldn't guarantee that. Not against a defending Luftwaffe fighting over its own territory. Quietly, the decision was made. The P-38 would be withdrawn from frontline escort duties over Germany. Its place would be taken by aircraft better suited to the job, fighters that could dive, turn, and recover without hesitation. It wasn't a condemnation of the Lightning's courage or capability. It was an admission of reality. In Europe's crowded, unforgiving skies, the P-38 had reached the edge of what it could give. And as it stepped aside, many believed its story as a fighter was ending, unaware that half a world away, the Lightning was about to prove just how wrong that assumption was. 15. While the Lightning's future dimmed over Europe, its story was being rewritten thousands of miles away, over endless ocean-dense jungle and vast distances that punished weakness. In the Pacific, the war obeyed different rules. And here, the P-38 Lightning finally found a sky that played to its strengths. When P-38s began arriving in late 1942, George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, immediately understood what he was looking at. This was not Europe. Missions stretch hundreds of miles over open water. An engine failure in a single-engine fighter meant almost certain death. For the Lightning, the second engine wasn't a liability, it was a lifeline. Pilots limped home on one. Engine again and again, aircraft riddled with holes, men alive who otherwise would not have been. The climate, so cruel in England, became an advantage. The unheated cockpit that froze pilots in Europe was a blessing in the tropics. Long-range escort interception ground attack. Suddenly the Lightning fit every mission. And against lightly armored Japanese aircraft, its nose-mounted guns were devastating. Pilots learned they could open fire from farther out with deadly accuracy. When a P-38 hit targets didn't limp away, they disintegrated. Japanese fighters were agile but fragile. They couldn't absorb punishment the way German aircraft could. The Lightning's concentrated fire turned brief firing windows into kills. Victories came fast. Confidence followed. This was the same airplane that struggled over Europe. But here, it was transformed. In the Pacific range mattered more than turn rate. Survival mattered more than elegance. And in this vast, unforgiving theater, the P-38 Lightning was no longer misunderstood. It was indispensable. 16. If the Pacific had proven the Lightning's value, one mission would seal its legend forever. In April 1943, American intelligence cracked a secret that could change the war. Japan's most important military mind, Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, was about to inspect frontline bases in the Solomon Islands. His route, his timing, every detail was known. There was only one problem. The target lay deep inside enemy territory, hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied airfield. No fighter in the U.S. arsenal could reach it, fight, and make it home. No fighter, except one. The mission was razor thin. Fuel calculations left no margin for error. Navigation had to be perfect. Surprise was everything. And failure meant flying straight into swarms of Japanese fighters with empty tanks on the return leg. The aircraft chosen was the P-38 Lightning, not because it was popular, but because it was the only machine capable of doing the impossible. On April 18, 1943, a small formation of Lightnings skimmed the ocean at wave-top height, radio, silent engines synchronized like a heartbeat. Minutes mattered. Seconds mattered. When Yamamoto's bombers finally appeared, the attack was sudden and merciless. Cannon and machine gun fire tore through the formation. One bomber crashed into the jungle below, carrying Japan's greatest strategist with it. The news exploded across America. Headlines blazed. Newsreels rolled. The Lightning was no longer a question mark. It was a symbol. This was not a dogfight won by luck. It was a precision strike made possible by range firepower and discipline. And from that day forward, the P-38 Lightning would forever be remembered as the aircraft that reached where no other fighter could and changed the course of the war with a single devastating blow. 17. After Yamamoto's death, the Lightning's reputation in the Pacific changed overnight. This was no longer just a capable fighter, it was a legend in the making. And legends need faces. The Pacific War soon found its own. At the center stood Richard Bong, quiet, soft-spoken, barely out of his teens. When he arrived in theater, Bong didn't look like a warrior. But in the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, he was relentless. He learned the Lightning's strengths intimately. Its climb, its firepower, its ability to strike first and kill instantly. Bong didn't spray bullets. He closed in. He waited. Then he fired once, and enemy aircraft vanished. Mission after mission, his score climbed. 4 kills in a single day, then more. By war's end, every one of his 40 victories had been scored in a P-38. No other American ace would ever match that record in a single aircraft type. He wasn't alone. Across the Pacific, the Lightning filled the scoreboards. Pilots like Thomas Maguire, Charles McDonald, and Jay Robbins all carved their names into history flying the same twin-boomed fighter. The pattern was undeniable. The top American aces of the Pacific were Lightning pilots. So valuable did Bong become that in 1945, the Army Air Forces made a rare decision. He was pulled from combat not for rest, not for fear, but because losing him would be too great a blow to morale. He became a living symbol of American air power, proof that the Lightning worked when flown to its strengths. In Europe, the P-38 was debated. In the Pacific, the argument was over. Here, under wide skies and long distances, the Lightning had found not just redemption, but dominance.